Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this last session that we are going to have in this beautiful conference. We are going to be doing during the next hour or so a little bit of storytelling, inspirational stories, inspirational talks, asking some questions to our guests here that you already know from the conference, probably. If you want to say something, introduce yourself or whatever, I don't think it's necessary, right? I'm missing it out. No, we are going to be asking some questions, but it's super important, I think, that you ask your own questions, because this is actually for all of you. So you're going to have an open Slido there, as we did during the previous days in the conference, so you can ask and throw some questions for them. So I'm going to start with the first question, I think. It's going to be for Mark. I mean, open source personally gave it a lot to me in my career. I'm pretty sure if any of you is in open source too, felt what it is like to be part of the community and contribute to something bigger. And I want to ask Mark, that I know he is a very active contributor to open source. How did he got in the first place for the first time in open source in general?
For me, it was quite a while ago now. I've been doing JavaScript for a long time, and what really got me into open source was actually like jQuery and the plugin community around that. And my first open source project was a jQuery plugin that I wrote for doing presentations in the browser. Obviously that's very standard now, but back then it was pretty rare. And I used it at my local meetup I talked about, I think it was jQuery Mobile, which is kind of not a very fashionable technology choice. But it was funny because at the end of my talk, people were more excited about the slide plugin that I'd written than the actual content of my talk.
That was back when exactly?
2011, I think it was.
Oh, that was a long time ago.
Yeah, and so I think that actually had a big impact on me, that what I created and what I contributed to the community had a much bigger impact than just parroting some opinions about something I'd consumed, and I think it had a big impact on me.
Okay, so I want to ask too, I am pretty sure it affected you in somehow personally, but in your professional career, how did open source contributed to your professional? How do you evolve during the years professionally?
I think there's a couple of things. I think the first thing is that I think it's where I actually learnt how to think more architecturally about my work, because when I go to work, often what I was dealing with was just these big code bases where you would just go and throw more code into this massive pile of code, right? And open source was what really trained me to think about breaking problems apart. jQuery, I talked about jQuery plugins, but it's a humble beginning, but like it taught me the idea of the whole concept of trying to create a core on which you can build plugins, and then you can have an ecosystem of plugins around that. And even those plugins could have their own plugins, and it just meant that people were able to better break apart the work and sort of spread it around and contribute asynchronously, which was interesting for me. And I think it just taught me how to build things in that way. And I think it was an opportunity for me to practice that in the way that I think a lot of people at work didn't get to practice that. But then the other thing as well, I think, is it helped connect me to the world. Again, like, if all I ever did was just go to work and do the work that was right in front of me, and then that was it, I didn't have that same connection to the broader community. And that continues to be a big influence on me, making me feel like I'm not just bringing the best ideas I can come up with, I'm bringing kind of the best ideas I'm getting from the wider community and sharing those ideas and challenging them and getting other people's views on it. And that's what these events are obviously all about as well. So those are the two big things for me.
Yeah, so another thing is, I think personally that with open source in general, that's one of the most important parts of JavaScript nowadays, and one of the powers of JavaScript, and I think you can kind of agree on that. But also, it brings us coming up with new ideas and libraries and stuff like that all the time, and it can be really hard to keep up with all this change. And if you're in open source and going to Twitter and whatever all the time, you might kind of be okay with keeping up with that. But there's this so-called fear of missing out, which is, I think, especially in the JavaScript community, a super important part. I'd like to ask Max this question. What do you think is a good way to deal with this fear of missing out? So how can you keep up to date without having to relearn and check everything every week or something like that?
So I'm going to talk about this a little bit from the San Francisco perspective and then apply it to JavaScript. So, because in San Francisco, obviously, or in the Bay Area in general, there's a huge amount of fear of missing out where people are always trying to jump onto the next thing. And I think once you realize a couple of basic facts about the way things work in the Bay Area, it kind of cures you of that disease. So I moved to San Francisco thinking that since there is so much innovation, so many startups there, that I was going to encounter just an insane amount of brilliant people really doing smart stuff. After all, if someone was willing to give you $20 million to go do something, they wouldn't do that unless you're really smart, right? Turns out that's not true at all. It's because the VCs, the money that they do make is they make so much in returns from the successful companies that it's in their best interest to kind of just spread it around. So when I realized this, I realized that most of the people, even though they had a lot of money, weren't necessarily doing something intelligent or something smart. And in fact, within 5 years, something like 90 to 95% of all startups are out of business. And even the bigger startups, a lot of them don't go public or get bought out. They don't have an exit for well over 8 to 10 or even longer years. So even if you were one early guy, your stocks may have expired by then. So once you realize that, it's like, okay, really, I'm more of a fear of getting conned by the next thing than I do have a fear of missing out. Because the next thing that everyone's jumping on, whether it's blockchain or what have you, if you jump on it too early and you're all excited, it's not necessarily going to work out better for me or for the community at large. And then there's other factors, like if you have no responsibilities and you're young, then go ahead, take a chance. If you're more mature, then you have to take a more measured response. So if you take that and apply it to technology, I think that there is a lot of this, especially in the front end community, about four years ago with frameworks, React, Backbone, Angular, that sort of thing. And there was a little bit of fear missing out there where everyone was trying to jump on the next thing. And then, so kind of taking a step back and ignoring it for a while, it would have been the smart thing to do. Because if you had jumped, say you chose Backbone 4 years ago and your app is still in Backbone today, that's going to cost you millions of dollars, because now you have to hire a bunch of people to rewrite it, or you have to find people to do it, and no one wants to do that. So kind of learning that lesson kind of helped me temper my approach, both to dealing with companies in the Bay Area, but also dealing with technology. You have to kind of calm down and see what the community at large. And this is one thing that we kind of rely on, often open source people. You got to be careful with the open source community, because that's all they do. They're really excited about the next thing. Yeah. Whereas you're on a product and you're like, wait a minute, I've got thousands of components and 1 million users. I need to take it easy before I start spending all this money updating to the next new thing. It's actually, and once you realize that, again, it's a fear of being conned. You could really cost yourself millions and millions of dollars because of a stupid fear, when really you need a smart fear, which is the fear of losing all this money and wasting all this time. Yeah.
Though that we're speaking about open source, one question for you. Who of you does remember MoTools? Raise your hand, please.
Somebody?
Some people. Wow. Because Daniel just joined us, and he actually was a core member of the modules back in the days. And I'd like to ask you the question, how do you feel about it today? How do you see the progress in JavaScript from modules to what it is today? And maybe even where do you see UI development is going in, for example, 10 years?
Thank you. Hi, that's a very interesting question. I wasn't core member. I was there, but I wasn't core member. The core members, there was a group for 10 people, and which it's a very interesting way they are right now. So, Tom Okino is the director of Facebook engineering. Jan Kassen is the author of the Facebook Relay, the GraphQL library. Guillermo Rauch is the founder of Zeit and author of many open source software. Jan Kassen, maybe, so this really for me, almost all those people ends up in the Facebook engineering and made the current maintainer of the React, the Sebastian Merkbich, also core developer of modules. So those guys, two guys made own companies, and the rest of them are working for. It's still interesting. After so many years from the modules, we are still doing and thinking about the same. How the web application should look like, how it should be designed. If you don't remember what the modules was, it was the competitor of the jQuery, built on some OOP techniques, object-oriented programming. And then because modules wasn't as successful as jQuery, and there were some different opinions about how things should be done, then went to the Facebook and made React and all that stuff. And for me, the future is probably incremental. Don't expect anything breathtaking, no big breaking changes, because it looks like some guy invented something new, but it's all incremental, progressive work. So we can see the React hooks toward is basically algebraic async effects in JavaScript. We will see the improving JavaScript. Maybe the people will switch to Reason, maybe not. I'm not sure, but if you want to know what will be popular in the next 3 years, take a look at the people who are productive right now. And by that people I mean the people around the React team and Facebook engineering.
Thank you. We're doing one more question from our list, and then we'll try to see if any one of you got any questions, because I don't think we got this slide. Ah, it's okay, I wasn't aware. So we got one more question, then we will pick some of those. And this question is for Anna. And I was pretty excited when I heard you're studying psychology, because I am doing this as well. And I want to...
Sebastian as well.
Yeah, really?
Sebastian from React Psychology as well.
Yeah, it looks like that's a common thing, actually. But I want to know why you're doing it, and especially in the context of development. How does it affect your engineering career?
There were quite a few reasons. One of them was that I was at a very miserable job where we were doing React wrapped up in .NET, and I was kind of wondering, why am I doing this to myself on a daily basis? So I decided that I want to do something different, and I bumped into a psychotherapy course. I thought it might be interesting, and I really loved it. But I also realized that we always ask ourselves questions in development. How do we do something? What framework do we choose? What tools do we choose? But we very rarely ask ourselves the question, why do we do something? And I actually really miss the sort of philosophical level to it, because I believe it's really important for us as human beings to know why we're doing it. You know, like the fact that we earn money or that it's fun to explore new things, that's great. But, you know, we all can burn out. We all can have difficulties in our careers. And knowing why we're doing it and being really aware of where we are as human beings actually proved really important for me.
That's really, really interesting. I want to ask you something related to this, which is that I know that personally, if I am only thinking about programming all the time, and thinking about code, I'm obsessed with technology, working too many hours. It's like sometimes I feel like it's super difficult to wrap my head around what I'm doing. So I need to jump into something else, and maybe those new ideas are coming to my mind, or new solutions or whatever. So I am curious about if you dedicate yourself to a different field like psychology is, see if you felt like that at some point, like it helped you becoming a better developer, doing something else.
I think so. I think that's true for everyone. You know, like we are in an industry where we're constantly told that if we were to be hired, we need to be enthusiastic and, you know, do extracurricular activities all the time. People are wondering whether you're contributing to open source and how much you're doing outside of your day-to-day job. So the pressure on us to do things like programming all the time is massive. And being able to get out of it is really important. Like I find, for example, that if I go for a run like halfway through the day, it really helps me to find a solution to the bugs that I was like looking at in the morning. So switching context works really well. There's actually a psychological theory behind that, and that is that essentially we've got conscious and unconscious mind, and the conscious mind is the one that constantly thinks and we're aware of what we're thinking. But there's the unconscious mind that is essentially a little bit like a storage, where you're sort of like just pushing extra information, and it's processing the information slowly in its own time. So if you find yourself really stuck on a problem, stop thinking about it, let it sort of sinking into the unconscious. It will process it on its own, and then later on at some point it will just like pop out the answer. So it's unreliable, but it's sometimes really helpful.
Okay, I'm studying psychology now. So we're gonna ask you some questions, guys, that we have there in Slido now. First one is computer science degree or similar required. How relevant is that today in hiring developers? I think that's a very interesting one. Like I'm interested about knowing if all of you are sharing like the same studying background or if you come from different places. I think that's super interesting. So who wants to start with that?
I don't have a uni degree.
Great.
So I'm a self-taught engineer, and that's unusual at PayPal. Although I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think most of the React team actually does not have a computer science degree, but that's another thing. But anyway, I think it depends on the position is my answer to this question, and I think that it's very rare that the position requires it. So I think that, and how relevant is it? So if you're working on like someone's hiring you to build an autocomplete or something like that, or a search, then I think that if you don't have a computer science degree, it's very fair for them to ask you very advanced computer science related questions, because that's going to be directly relevant to what you're doing. If you're getting hired to build UIs, I think it's absolutely ludicrous to hire based on these questions. And I actively discourage my team actually from asking any algorithms whatsoever in hiring. And that's not common I work at PayPal, for those of who you don't know. That's not common at PayPal, but amongst my team, I try to tell them not to, because I care much more about. I don't feel like we get a good idea of how this person is going to work. Is this person going to be able to do the job based on whether or not they can complete several difficult algorithm questions, especially when you're talking about front-end developers and node developers. Again, it'd be a different thing if we were talking about search, if we were hiring someone to do a search or something like that, but that's my thought.
I think it should be mentioned that Google, Facebook, and several other companies recently dropped the requirement to have a degree. And as I remember, the Apple does that. My friend is working on Siri, and they hired him because they liked him. He was actually core developer of the Angular, and they told him, we will learn you what we need. So we like your personality and culture approach, and if you are a good person, if you are if you want to learn something new or something like that. So I think the school degree is not relevant anymore, and if you want to need more information, Google unschooling, and you will soon realize that the classic school is shit.
So I think that was actually more of a public relations thing, because the interview process doesn't reflect that policy at all. I think that actually Facebook is starting to incorporate more of a front-end interview, which I think is a little bit more friendly to self-taught developers. But I mean, say Google says, okay, we're now going to not have a requirement for a computer science degree. Their ridiculous interview process already severely biases them towards younger people fresh out of computer science, which is who they primarily hire, which I think is a mistake personally. But I mean, they've tried other things, and then they just said, this is what works best for us. So maybe that's okay, but the problem really is that it's trickled down to the rest of the industry. And once like other startups like, I don't know, Airbnb, Uber, Coinbase, once they start to get successful, they think, oh, now it's time to grow up and be more like Google and have this ridiculous interview process.
That's a very interesting point.
And in my opinion, like, the interview process is the single worst part about my job. And like, I think it's a poison on the entire industry, actually. I think that there needs to be a more progressive approach, and people need to actually think creatively and outside the box. And the worst part is when I talk to a lot of people from Google, Facebook, all over the valley, they all seem to know this, but no one really does anything about it. They just talk about it, and it's like, well, but the director level people aren't willing to listen to us. So it's frustrating. And like I said, what I do, I have influence on my team, I have influence in my organization, but I don't have influence in the whole company, and I certainly don't influence anyone beyond my company. Anyway, that's my opinion on it.
I just want to add that when we are hiring developers, we very rarely look at whether they have computer science degree or even whether they have the actual skill set that we're using. We are looking at whether the person wants to learn, and that is really the most important thing. And that has been the case in a lot of companies where I've worked.
So I just want to add that personally, I think that the best way to interview a candidate is to go through a trial where you can just work with this person for some time and see how it performs and if he's capable of solving problems that you have in your in a day-by-day basis. But also, I like your point, but it is true that when a company is getting so big, it's very difficult to get somebody into that super hardcore organization so they can contribute for maybe 1 week, 1 month or whatever, and then decide whether it's a good choice or if it's not. But that's fucked up. I don't like it either. So we want to jump to the next question, which is have you ever joined a company have you ever joined a company, taken one look around and instantly wanted to change everything about how they worked? And if so, did you do it? That's interesting too. So, anybody?
I've sort of gone through this. It's actually where I work now. I've been there for about 5 years, and the company has changed ridiculously in that amount of time. I can't take all the credit. I can take some of it. Like a lot of different areas have changed. When I showed up, as far as front end was concerned, they were very much like a .NET shop. The JavaScript code was like in a folder deep within a .NET project, and it wasn't using any of the. When you think 5 years ago, like the state of JavaScript tooling was not where it is today, but sort of node-based testing tools, for example, were starting to become a bit more popular. Tooling like that wasn't being used. Within the company, there was like one team that was doing a JavaScript single-page app. They were doing the mobile site, a separate mobile site. We're responsive now, but at the time it was a separate site. And that was an Angular single-page app. And that was like the holy land. If you were a JavaScript developer joining this company, it was like, get me on the mobile team. Yeah, I worked really hard over a number of years to change the culture and try and get a bit more of the mainstream kind of open source JavaScript culture embedded in the company. And it took a lot of work and a lot of influencing, but we managed to turn it around. We actually got, we managed to get the homepage of the site, and keep in mind this is like one of the biggest sites in Australia. We got the homepage server-rendered React on a Node server. Super progressive for this company, right, in terms of where we'd come from. So I think you can turn it around. It can take a long time and a lot of effort, but yeah, it can be done.
Nice. Anybody else want to add something to that? No? Cool. So we are gonna get together the next two questions, which is how can I start contributing to open source as a beginner developer? Most projects seems to be quite complex and I don't know what can I do for it. And the other one, I think it's pretty related, which is contributing to open source difficult in terms of work-life balance? Like the first question is actually answering the second one, like it's it is difficult. It's not that difficult, it depends on the project in my opinion, but you guys?
I can say something. So first of all, addressing the first question, I think the best thing you can do is, if you want to contribute to your open source, is to check if there's anything that, in general, you are not happy with at this library or tool or whatever, and not like going there, okay, I want to contribute, what can I do? Because most of the time, when you're using something, you will come up with an issue at any point pretty often. And then you know the context and everything, and then you can get in contact with the maintainers and whatever. And in general, most of the open source maintainers are happy if they get contributors, and they are super happy to help you and guide you through the process of contributing. And I think the most important thing is to not be like shy or to not have any fear of just trying and doing, because even if you're sending in a pull request that is later not accepted, it's still important to send it, because it's going to start a discussion and you learn the process and everything. Yeah, and that's, I think, the most important part of open source. And especially with this, the project is super complex. I kind of have this feeling on my own with my own open source projects from time to time. When I come back after some weeks and I want to fix something and I'm like, oh, what? I don't understand anything. Then again, it's super fun if you ask them. They are super happy to help. So most of the times they have at least some contributing guides which you can check, and just play around with the repository and you will get into the code at some point. Yeah, and then the next question, we can add something on that later, but I want to say something to the next question. It can be difficult in terms of work-life balance, especially in the beginning. If you're getting into open source and you get some contributors, some users and whatever, and it's a super nice experience having people using your library, and you want to provide the best experience and you put a lot of time in there and you fix and stuff, you add new features you're probably not even using yourself, and you can quickly come to a point where it's kind of burning you out and you might not even realize it at that point. And I've seen a lot of open source developers reaching that point at some time, then taking a break or just giving the project to someone else in general, and they learn from this process. But if I should give an advice, it's probably to not rush on every issue to fix it and whatever, because you can also ask people to send pull requests. Then you get more contributors, you get more like a group of people contributing. Yeah, and it's your free time. That's the most important thing. Is you don't have to do anything of that. It's your free project. Everyone can fork it, contribute, whatever. And yeah, that's the point. If you're not happy with the situation, if you feel overwhelmed, just stop it, because you're not getting any money, obviously, and it's just not worth it. And then there's the other way. Especially if you're working at a bigger company, you might go and ask them if there's the possibility to spend some work time to contribute to the open source project. Especially if you're using this library at your company, then they will most likely be like, okay, you can have 20% of your time or something like that, and that can help to improve your work-life balance. It can help to improve the library in general, and in the end it helps your employee because you're working on this library but not getting sick over time. Yeah.
I would just like to answer the first question in a bit more detail, and that is there are quite a few repositories and open source projects that are very well managed, and they have labels that are specifically for beginners. So they are, generally speaking, issues that are very easy to pick up. I know, for example, the serverless framework has things like that. But I know that a lot of large frameworks would have these kind of labels. Also, a lot of these places would have Slack or Discord channels where people are very happy to walk you through it, explain to you how to run the project, etc. So I would say if you just want to sort of see if you can do a little bit here and there, then large projects that have proper management behind them are the easiest way to go, because they'll be able to help you out to get started. And yes, it is impossible to have work-life balance with doing open source.
I think there's another option here as well that worked well for me, which is just go and build your own stuff. Don't try and contribute to other people's stuff at the beginning. It's like I said, it's just a different approach. But for me, I found that actually was really useful because it gave me that kind of free space to explore kind of end to end how does open source work. Because I had to do everything. I had to write the documentation. I had to figure out how to publish it. I had to really learn about how versioning works, and I had to just end to end. But I was doing it in a space where I had complete freedom and I didn't have to worry too much. And then just blatantly copy everything that you can see. So if you're, in my case, going back 5 years ago, I was just looking at other jQuery plugins that I liked, and I was like, okay, what are they doing? And I would just copy, and I would pick up all sorts of stuff like, oh, this one has unit tests. I've never written unit tests before. Copy, paste, tweak. Like, okay, now I'm writing my first unit tests. And I learned so much that way, like a heap. And like I said, because it was all in my own space that I'd created, I didn't have to ask anyone's permission to do any of this. I could just endlessly kind of learn new things and plug them into this repository. And I think that gives you maybe a better foundation, that when you start to contribute to other projects, you have a better sense of how it all kind of hangs together.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Like the best way to learn is just to start your own stuff and just play around with it and get your mind around how the whole thing works. But I want also to add that as a beginner, when you are visiting some open source project that you want to contribute to, you should never, ever, ever be afraid of asking. Even though maybe you are thinking that you're about to ask something super stupid and you are going to look like an idiot, still, maybe that question is not that stupid. I'm pretty sure everyone in college or in high school experienced that from teachers, like, don't be afraid to ask. Also, I think it's super important that if you want to contribute to an open source project, you should already be using that project somehow. Like getting time just to dedicate just for free because you just are going to sit in front of the computer and start reading code and try to make up something new or get an issue and solve it when the project is not related at all with your work. That's almost impossible. That's unmaintainable. It's going to last for 1 week. After that, you're going to get frustrated and go back to your hole. So, Robin?
I won't continue with next. Just to finish this off, I think another important concept is to not being afraid at all at failing in general, because if you're looking at an open source project with a lot of stars and whatever, maybe there are people speaking at conferences and everything, and you might have this feeling like, oh, they are like super professionals and they never do fail and whatever, and you might be afraid of even asking them something because they're way higher than you. But of course, obviously there's a beginning for everyone, and all of them started at some point, and they got up there by failing a lot as well. Yeah, and that's the something I want to ask next, because now we only talked about some kind of positive stuff, but I want to get a bit sensitive and ask, first of all, Javi, but we can maybe have other answers if you want to, because I know he got a super kind of interesting and funny story. So what was your biggest failure as a developer?
My biggest failure was trying to be too professional. Like literally, I was working for a company a couple of years, not a couple, but more, like 4 years ago or something like that. I was working for this company. I was doing Ruby backend development, and I remember there was this bug, super annoying in production, and we were able to reproduce that in staging. So since I couldn't reproduce the bug locally, what I did is to point or test suite to the staging database. So I was able to write a test to reproduce the bug. And as a good professional, I wanted to write first the failing test. So I did the test, it failed, and I fixed the test. And then before pushing, I wanted to run the whole test suite to make sure I didn't break anything. So you know what? I forgot to change the reference to the database, and of course it dropped after the whole test is run. So I basically dropped the whole database that we have in staging that took like 2 years it has like 2 years of data to reproduce like kind of production stuff. Luckily there was a backup over there, but I was like frozen, like, oh my God, what did I do? And for the record, nothing happened after that. Like, shit just happens. It's fine. Don't be afraid, but don't delete the production database. You can avoid that. Yeah. So, any other story?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that we did our first like server-rendered React app at Seek, where I work. So we were out in production to a subset of users, not 100%, but we were out in production, and it was actually the first CSS modules project. And we were using the standard kind of hashed class names in production. But I saw Glenn Madden, among some other people, were being pretty clever with it, and they were using emojis instead of hashes, if any of you have seen that. So when you open the dev tools or view source, every class name on every element was an emoji or a series of emojis. And I really wanted to do that. I thought it would be funny. So it was supported by Webpack, so I literally just swapped it out, the hash for an emoji, checked it on my local environment, looked fine, and went out to production. And I think there was an issue with like the character encoding where the values coming back from the server for the HTML were different from the CSS file, and it actually just basically meant there was 0 CSS on our site. And our build pipeline, even though it was like, so we had continuous delivery, I was able to fix it, but it was like a 10-minute window of where like one of the biggest sites in Australia had no CSS. And like Seek's a pretty good company, like a lot of companies, where if you make an honest mistake and you own up to it, it'll be fine. But it was like the stupidest reason why I did it. Like I knew that if anyone asked me like, hey, so what's the story? Like what went wrong? And if I had to explain it, so luckily no one actually, like I solved that problem by being very much on the front foot and explaining before I was asked that something went wrong. I'm already on it, I'm fixing it. I don't think I said that it was because it was emojis. No one asked me, but I learned a valuable lesson. Don't do things that you couldn't explain with a straight face. You can make honest mistakes, but don't be stupid.
Any other fucked up stories? Yeah.
I was working at Pizza Hut relatively recently, where we did the whole revamp for the website in React, and everything's went great. But the problem was that the moment we merged to master, it shipped into production. We had 100% test coverage, but all those tests were only written to have 100% test coverage, so they didn't test anything. We didn't really do code reviews because that was just slowing us down, and obviously we had no QAs. So essentially, the thing was that I, as a developer, was fully responsible for things to work out, and most of the time that was fine. But after a while, I got a little bit tired, and especially there's this thing in Pizza Hut where you can have half and half pizzas, and that was a pain in the ass to test. So I decided I won't test half and half pizzas, which was Friday afternoon. And for Pizza Hut, the main peaks are like, you know, Friday midnight when people are going home drunk. So I shipped this thing into production, and on Saturday morning I found out that the company lost around £60,000 in that one night because people could not order half and half pizzas. So that was my story.
Interesting one. Max, that story? Have you bring down PayPal sometime?
No, it'd be way more than £60,000 if I went down PayPal thing. Well, this isn't a story, but no, I'll tell something else. I think there might be legal ramifications in some of the stories that I have, but I don't have like a really like hilarious dev story. But I will say that like some of the biggest mistakes that I've made as a developer are not trusting my gut, and that can be from everything from like allowing someone to talk me into, oh, it's okay if we comment out this test just for now. And I'm like, I know that's wrong, but I guess you talked me into it. Or everything from like, I was briefly a consultant, and you know, I took a contract that never really felt right, but they, you know, were offering me more money, so I was like, I guess I'll do it, and it just wasn't a good thing. So my lesson from those things were, it's better to be wrong going with your gut than to go against your gut and then find out you're wrong later.
Okay, cool. So we're gonna do one more from the Slido and then jump back to some that we have prepared here. So, how many hours per day are you programming? In my case, it depends a lot on the day, the week, the month, the sprint, the people, a lot of stuff. Like maybe there is one day that I spend, it also depends on where are you working at. Like for example, in my case, I'm working remotely, so we are very flexible on the hours that we dedicate to work. Like if I want to work the whole night, or maybe sometimes I am required to work during the whole night, I should be up to do it. But it depends. So sometimes I spend the whole day working, but in my regular work, not open source project or side projects or whatever. Or sometimes it's a little bit more relaxed. But I remember this time when I was building this open source project, React Toolbox, I remember that I was building that in a complete separate time from my job position. So the thing is that I worked for like 7 to 8 hours a day in my normal job, and then I switched back to the open source project I was working in. The result is that I worked for a month and a half or 2 months or something, like the whole day, almost every single day. So it was a shitload of work. And that's why I was pointing out before that if you are working in an open source project that you are not really using, it's just not worthy. And you shouldn't dedicate more than, I don't know, I'm not gonna tell you like 7 hours. If you really enjoy what you're doing, it's perfectly fine if you spend a little bit more. But you have to find the time to relax, to practice some sports, or to just disconnect from what you're doing, because later you're gonna be way more productive. So in my case, not less than 7 hours a day, not much more than 10 maybe, but it depends a lot. So anybody here? So
I'll answer this question. I'll answer it first, personally, what I actually do, and then a more general answer. So, I mean, I get to work pretty early, way before anyone else on my team. So almost the bulk of I would say 90% of all the coding I do is like the first 3 hours I get to work because no one's there. And then after that, most of my day is very little coding. It's much more talking with other people, helping other people, meetings, things like that. But kind of related to this is progression as a developer. You kind of have a choice which way you want to go. And in general, the more senior, the more up you go, the less coding you do, which might seem counterintuitive, but that's kind of how it works. You tend to be more like almost a consultant for your team or your company, you know, sharing your experience and sharing your wisdom with these different situations and acting more like an architect. Whereas, you know, actually coding UI, for example, that wouldn't be a good use of somebody who's got, you know, 10 years experience or something like that. So don't be surprised if earlier on in your career you're coding a lot more. This is different for if you're working on open source, by the way, but if you're you know, working on a product, don't be surprised if you code less and less as you progress. And then also, I mean, as a sign of a really good program is like you wrote it and it doesn't need, it just works. I mean, if you wrote something and your team and your company is still using it like 2 or 3 years down the road, great. Like you're like attend some meetings and go home. Like you really earned your keep.
So my answer for how many hours per day are you programming? What programming is it? Is it thinking? And do you want to think fast or slow? Which kind of thinking is better? I bet the slow thinking, slow, deep. So from that point of view, some people are much more productive if they work just for 5-6 hours per day. And the other programmers can work 15-16 hours, and it's totally not worth it because the code they produce is toxic, buggy, and always remember the best code is the code is not written. This is the best code you can ever write, not existing code. You will realize that after maybe 10 years in the industry, but you can count on hours because it easily can be work for work. And of course the life and work balance is very important. So without the rest you will not be productive. And last advice, my friend has a company, he's hiring, he's selling the developers to other companies, and they can't work more than 6 hours per day. Because only 6 hours you can be focused, productive, and the rest of the day you really need a blank white spaces for the brain to relax. Even watching the eating animal or watching the cat's pictures on the internet is a kind of the relax.
I want to add just only one more thing, which is that when I said that it depends how much time I spent working, I really mean it. Like, for example, there was one day quite recently that I was like feeling like shit. I couldn't do anything properly, so I barely worked that day. But there was this other day, and it was like in April or something like that, that I worked like 23 hours in a row. Really, no bullshit.
All right, we only got 10 minutes left, and there's one more question, or maybe like 2 questions. Sorry?
I said that last question is really good. The latest question, the one at the bottom.
Yeah, we can.
People upvote that one. That was really good.
Oh. Yeah.
Yeah, we can maybe do this after this. We probably have the time, but there's one more on my list which I want to ask. Because obviously we're at a conference right now, and we are all conference speakers up here, and it might be interesting if you have any advice at all how to get into speaking at the conference. So this is the first part, but then I also want to ask you, are there any downsides you're experiencing speaking at a conference?
It takes time. Seriously, if you want to go speak on a conference, make something interesting and they will ask you. That's all. And it's exhausting actually, because if I know I will have to deliver the message, I need to think at least a week about it to deliver the message. So the 30 minutes is just the compression of the long thinking. So yes, there are trade-offs. I would like to explain this, to answer the self-explanatory code or good comments. Every comment is fail, but it's very common for developer to fail. So every comment you have to write is actually somehow the fail. But it's very common for us as developers failing all the time. So comments are just fine.
I'll just add to the conference question. Make sure you know why you want to do it, whether it's to attract talent, meet high class developers, or expose more people to your technology or to your opinion, or make sure you understand why you're doing it, and then just re-emphasize that it's really exhausting. Like, I am so tired, and I'm sure all you guys are too. It's mentally draining, and it is a lot of work. So.
Oh, yes.
Part of that question was how to get started. So I got started personally with speaking at local meetups. Actually, I mentioned it before, like talking about jQuery Mobile at my local JavaScript meetup. That was my first sort of public speaking engagement, and that was really great for me. It was really influential kind of time for me. I actually found that as somewhat, I guess, of an introvert, it was actually a really useful way to connect with people, because people came to me to talk about what I was talking about. I'm not very good at approaching other people. So that, and that continues to be very useful for me. Like, I come to a conference and people are just constantly coming up to me, talking about what I was talking about and just naturally having conversations. Whereas if I go to a conference as an attendee, I actually struggle to talk to people. So that's, I don't know, I thought that might be interesting. But yeah, I guess the downside is definitely the time it takes is a big thing. I could go on about that. I guess another thing that I definitely struggle with a little bit is it's somewhat addictive talking at conferences, and which is in and of itself is not necessarily bad, but it definitely creates this drive of like, I need to make sure I've got the next thing to talk about. And it's something of a healthy drive, but it can tend towards unhealthy sometimes, because I'm just so focused on making sure I'm on the bleeding edge of something, whether or not maybe that's not actually the smartest move for me. I should find something stable and just do something boring for 2 years. But talking about something boring is not going to fly at a conference, so I've got to find something exciting. So I've got to be careful that I actually make sure I continue to make the right calls where I work, and I'm not just picking some shiny technology because it'll get me on the stage next year. That can be hard.
Yeah, I also want to add something here. First of all, is that you, just like the open source contributing, you should not give up at all. But go and send proposals, try out like everything you want to do, and you will get on the stage at some point if you have something that's interesting. And for example, I sent, I think, 20 different proposals last year, and I only got like to the ReactiveConf here, and it'd still be fine, because yeah, I try on, and I'm happy if I can speak at the conference, but it's also fine to not go there. And about the content of the talk, I guess you have to be aware that you're probably not going to attract anyone in the audience. There will also be people who completely disagree with what you're telling. And then there's this imposter syndrome, which is making you feel like you know nothing. And this is especially true like 1 or 2 days before your talk. But then you have to keep in mind, if you're presenting something that you were using and exploring with your team or at your project, at your work, it's probably something that more people suffer from than just you. And so it might be interesting to present it to people. And then the last thing I can say is even if it looks like people up on stage are super kind of professional, not super relaxed and anything at all, it's kind of only pretending to be. I've been tracking my heart rate during my talk on Monday. It was average 150 and it went up to 170. So yeah, your body is like completely stressed out. But I think that's a good point, because you got adrenaline and you feel more excited about what you're talking, and that's kind of normal, I guess, I hope.
Nice. So since we are running out of time, I want to ask 2 questions. Everyone have to ask to answer, and with just like very quickly. So the question is, well, two questions, because that one, self-explanatory code or good comments, I think it's nice too. So I want to ask you, when did you modify your slides for the last time before giving your talk? In my case, it was like 5 minutes, something like that. And I think that good comments are bullshit. Self-explanatory code is way better, always. So
I could literally just say the same thing. Not 5 minutes, I'm not that bleeding edge. But yeah, I was definitely fixing my slides in the morning, because on Monday morning I came to do a tech check and I was told that my talk is 25 minutes and not 40 as I originally thought. So I was literally redoing my talk 2 hours before my talk because I just got confused. And yeah, definitely self-explanatory code. I don't really know of any place where good comments are good, apart from where there is really weird business case and you need to write like, so that person told me that this weird thing needs to happen, otherwise just good code.
I think with my talk this time, the last I changed my slides was maybe the night before, like right before bed. I did a trial run and I tweaked it. I mean, it's funny, like when I was early on in speaking, I had this almost snobbish idea of like, oh, if you're at a conference and you're tweaking your slides, how unprofessional is that? Like, is your talk not finished? Now that I've spoken a bit more, I completely understand why, and it's because a talk is actually never finished. You could forever just keep tweaking it, and it's just that drive to just make it better. And as long as you have more time, you'll keep trying to make it better. And if you give the same talk again, you'll have another opportunity to make it slightly better. So it's just a natural thing. It's not necessarily that we're procrastinating, although that does happen. And as far as the self-explanatory code or good comments, actually similar to what I just said, I think I used to be quite snobbish about this as well. You know, you should never write comments. I think I've particularly in the kind of work I've been doing recently, I've learned how wrong that is actually, to be honest, because there's certain classes of code where you should actually have more comments than code. A good example is if you go look at the Create React App code base. That's the kind of code base where it's full of esoteric, like, configuring of Webpack, and there's no way to code that in a good, readable, self-explanatory way. You've got to have like a wall of comments, like, why the hell are you doing that? And whenever I've added, we've got a similar tool at Seek, and whenever I add comments like that to it, people love it. They just absolutely love it because they can finally make sense of this crazy code base. And that's it.
So I also changed my slides the night before, but it wasn't a big change. It was just because I had given the same talk in Verona a few weeks ago, and it still, my React app still said hello Verona instead of hello Prague. But in general, I could have added quite a bit because hooks were very relevant to my talk, and I talked about hooks towards the end of my talk, and then I think there was a couple of questions I had at hooks. I chose not to go into it, in part because I didn't want to start talking too in-depth about something that was only 4 days old, and that I mean, to be honest, I had heard about hooks for about a month, but I saw my first demo at ReactiveConf on Thursday, which is not even a week ago. I had a lot of opinions on it, but I didn't want to present myself like I was an expert and then like have a bunch of stuff up there. So that's basically why I didn't, although it would have been relevant to mine. And in terms of this last question, you should make your code as clear as possible so that people could read. I mean, however, I don't have an aversion to comments. I think if in my apps, which are product apps, if I had a wall of comments, I'd be unhappy. But something like, here's what's happening here, like one line, a couple of words, that's pretty nice. I think in open source code, it's particularly nice to have a lot of comments. Create React App is a fantastic example. And in general, your Webpack is a great example of a place where there should be a lot of comments. Because, I mean, if you guys are anything like me, you touch Webpack once every 4 months or something like that. And then you go back and you're like, oh, I forget how this thing works. And there's all this. It's not like, it doesn't read like a normal thing. So it's a good place to have some comments.
Yeah, so speaking about the slides, I think the last time I changed the slide was on Sunday. I'm tweaking like the presenter notes to add some notes for myself like all the time. But I was especially heavily changing the slides 4 days ago, where I kind of threw all my slides away and did them again. Yeah, I kind of went through this process 3 or 4 times until I finally got there. Yeah, but maybe Sunday was the last real change to the actual talk, because at some point you have to just stop and use the version you got now, because you will always have something to change later.
Have you guys ever screwed up changing your slides? Because that happened to me. Like I put the wrong slide in there, and I was just like, oh, well, okay, you know, I just went with it. So, I mean, that's like a fear of mine. Like if I know that it's good, and I go change it the night before, I could screw something up.
Yeah, to me, in my case, more than changing the slide itself was changing the notes. Yeah. So I was like, at some point, I didn't remember exactly what I put in the notes. So I was like kind of reading for a second, but since it was last moment, I didn't remember that I put it there. I'm kind of like locked for a second, like, next slide. So.
I don't touch that slides because I have special process to creating slides. If I know I will have to talk about something, I have just some notes and dump my thoughts on the one paper, and day before the talk, and I just put some order in that, and that's all. And I don't touch because the rearranging comes from you are nervous, not sure about what we are talking about, but I gave so many talks, I don't care about that anymore. Just, it doesn't matter the order. The message must be delivered, and the message is generally quite simple, so that's all.
That's it, I guess. So yeah, in general, thank you for coming, for those inspirational stories. I hope you learned some new insights and got some inspiration in general. And also, I think all of us will be there at the after party later on. So if there's anything not answered here, or something you want to know, feel free to approach us. And I guess every speaker who's around there, just go and ask them. And yeah, we also got asked to. Oh, what's it? Yeah, we got asked to finish the conference, because this was basically the last official event happening here. Yeah, and we just want to go back. Yeah, we want to thank all of you for coming to this conference, for enjoying those 3 days with us. I had a lot of fun here. I think we all had a lot of fun here. We hope you had a lot of fun too. Just great to be part of this community. Yeah, and thank you for coming this year. Hopefully we'll see all of you next year as well. Also, special thanks to Microsoft for having us here today for the festival day. I really enjoyed this whole building. I guess you do too. We had food, we had beer, we had everything. It was super cool here. And of course, the most important thing is there will be an after party later at 6 p.m. or a.m. And it will happen here in this very same venue. And we hope we will all have this one last after party with you.
Second floor.
Yeah, yeah, of course. It's on the second floor in this building. And then, of course, we have to thank all the sponsors that kind of made this whole event possible. Because without them, we wouldn't be able to do this. So yeah, big thanks to all the sponsors. And also big thanks to the whole Reactive team who've been working almost the whole year on putting this conference up, and especially thanks to Mickey and her core team for preparing everything. Yeah, and that's it from us. Thank you for being here with us, and enjoy this last day.